July 1943. Sicily. Winston Churchill sat in his study at 10 Downing Street, reading a classified cable from Allied headquarters. His cigar had gone out. He reread the first line 3 times. General Patton has physically struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion. Eisenhower considering disciplinary action. Churchill set the cable down and stared at the wall. In the British Army, such behavior meant immediate dismissal, court-martial, disgrace. Churchill expected the Americans would do the same. But then the second cable arrived. Patton retained in command, reprimanded but deemed too valuable to lose. Churchill looked at his chief of staff and said, "Either the Americans don't understand military discipline, or they understand something we don't." And in that moment, Churchill realized he was dealing with a general who defied every assumption he'd ever made about American military leadership. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most complex relationships, please hit that like button and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in London, Washington, or Berlin. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. Now, let's continue. Winston Churchill had seen it all by 1943. Dunkirk, the Blitz, El Alamein, 5 years of total war. He'd worked alongside every major Allied commander, assessed their strengths, catalogued their weaknesses, formed careful judgments about American military capability. The Americans were brave, certainly, well-equipped, undoubtedly, but inexperienced, clumsy in operational matters, in need of British guidance. Then George S. Patton entered the theater, and every single assumption Churchill held about American generals shattered like glass. Patton didn't behave like other Allied commanders. He didn't defer to British experience. He didn't accept limitations. He didn't follow protocols that had governed British military conduct for centuries. Churchill watched, sometimes with horror, occasionally with grudging admiration, as this theatrical American general did 15 things no one expected. 15 actions that changed the war and challenged everything Churchill thought he knew about American forces. Let's begin. Number 15. Slap soldiers and keep his command. The slapping incidents in Sicily reached Churchill within days. 2 separate soldiers suffering combat fatigue, both struck by their commanding general, both incidents witnessed by medical staff. Churchill's reaction was immediate. "He's finished," Churchill told his military secretary. "No general survives striking enlisted men. Not in any professional army. British military culture, rooted in centuries of class-conscious tradition, would have ended Patton's career instantly. Court-martial proceedings within 48 hours. Dismissal within a week. Public disgrace thereafter." Churchill waited for the inevitable announcement. It never came. Eisenhower issued a reprimand, made Patton apologize, but kept him in command. Churchill was genuinely stunned. He questioned Eisenhower directly during their next meeting. "Do Americans not understand military discipline? How can such behavior be tolerated?" Eisenhower's response was pragmatic. "Patton is too valuable to lose. His battlefield capabilities outweigh his personal failings." Churchill, pragmatist that he was, eventually understood the calculation, but he never accepted it. He told his war cabinet, "There are principles that matter more than tactical genius. Though I admit, privately, that Britain lacks anyone with Patton's aggressive capabilities." Number 14. Move an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard, December 19, 1944. Versailles. Churchill received the transcript of Eisenhower's emergency conference. Patton had promised to pivot 3 divisions, over 50,000 men, and attack north toward Bastogne in 48 hours, in a blizzard, through frozen terrain, changing direction 90 degrees while maintaining combat readiness. Churchill's first response was to verify the report. Surely no general would make such a promise. When confirmed, Churchill told his staff, "Either Patton is mad or he's the finest operational commander of this war. We shall know in 2 days which." British generals had spent weeks preparing far smaller operations. Montgomery's careful planning meant months of preparation before major offensives. The idea of pivoting an entire army with all its supply lines, communications, artillery support in 48 hours defied military logic. Then Patton delivered. On December 26th, lead elements of Third Army smashed into German positions south of Bastogne. Churchill was forced to revise every assessment he'd made about American operational capability. He sent a private message to Eisenhower. Patton's relief of Bastogne represents the kind of operational audacity we British have been missing since 1940. Congratulations on having such a commander, even if he is difficult. Number 13. Publicly criticize Allied strategy. British military protocol was absolute. Officers never publicly criticized strategy, never questioned command decisions, never broke ranks. Patton ignored this completely. He told journalists Allied strategy was too cautious, criticized decisions to halt at certain objectives, openly disagreed with operational choices made by Supreme Headquarters. Churchill, who valued unity of command above all else, was appalled. He complained directly to Roosevelt. Patton is undermining Allied cohesion. He must be controlled. Roosevelt's response baffled him. Americans value frank speaking. Patton's opinions reflect aggressive spirit. Churchill couldn't comprehend it. In the British system, such insubordination would be crushed immediately. That Americans tolerated it suggested a fundamentally different military culture. Churchill wrote in his diary, "They are impossible to work with, and yet somehow they win battles." Number 12. Race Montgomery to Messina. Churchill had personally approved the Sicily plan. Montgomery had operational priority. American forces would support. Clear hierarchy. British experience guiding American enthusiasm. Then reports arrived that Patton was racing Montgomery to Messina. Churchill's reaction mixed amusement with concern. Competition was healthy. But this bordered on insubordination. When Patton actually beat Montgomery to the objective, Churchill faced acute embarrassment. Britain's most celebrated field marshal had been humiliated by an American general who was supposed to be in a supporting role. Churchill had to congratulate the Americans while consoling Montgomery. His private diary entry was revealing. Patton embarrassed Montgomery at Messina. But perhaps Montgomery needed embarrassing. British forces have become too methodical, too cautious. This American cowboy, theatrical as he is, understands that wars are won through speed and aggression, not careful planning alone. I wish we had a British general with half of Patton's audacity. Number 11. Advocate for arming Germans against Soviets. By May 1945, Churchill was desperately concerned about Soviet intentions. He'd been trying to warn Roosevelt, then Truman, about the threat Stalin posed to post-war Europe. Then Patton began publicly advocating for keeping German units intact, possibly rearming them to fight the Soviets. Churchill was simultaneously pleased and horrified. Pleased someone agreed with his assessment. Horrified that Patton said it so bluntly. Churchill tried to use Patton's statements to support his own, more diplomatically worded concerns. But Patton's crude language made Churchill's carefully crafted arguments seem extreme by association. Churchill wanted containment, strategic planning, diplomatic pressure. Patton wanted to fight the Soviets immediately, rearm the Germans and drive east. Churchill found himself in the strange position of distancing himself from an ally who actually agreed with him. Number 10. Ignore supply limitations. Churchill understood logistics intimately. Modern armies moved on supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, food all had to flow forward or operations stopped. When Churchill learned Patton was advancing across France despite fuel shortages, ignoring orders to halt for resupply, his reaction was immediate. Either the American supply system is far better than reported, or Patton is conducting operations that will end in disaster. Third Army continued advancing, successfully. Churchill demanded explanations. British generals couldn't provide them. Patton's supply officers were scrounging, appropriating, improvising at levels British quartermasters considered impossible. They stole fuel from other units, captured German stocks, ran trucks until they broke down, then cannibalized them for parts. Churchill began to suspect American logistical flexibility was a significant military advantage Britain lacked. Patton proved you could fight effectively on insufficient supplies if you moved fast enough that the enemy couldn't exploit your vulnerability. Number 9. Cross the Rhine before Montgomery's elaborate Operation Dot. This was the moment. Churchill questioned whether Patton was brilliant or insane. Churchill had approved Montgomery's Operation Plunder. Massive artillery preparation. Airborne drops. Overwhelming force. Churchill planned to observe personally as a demonstration of British military excellence. Then, on March 22, 1945, Patton quietly crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, before Montgomery's operation even launched, with minimal preparation. No airborne support, just assault boats and audacity. Churchill was preparing speeches about British operational excellence. He had to hastily revise them to acknowledge Americans had crossed first. His secretary recorded his private reaction. Patton has made Montgomery look like a slow, over-careful schoolmaster compared to a daring student who solves the problem while the teacher is still writing on the blackboard. This is either brilliant opportunism or reckless risk-taking. Given that it succeeded, I suppose we must call it brilliant. Churchill visited both crossing sites. At Montgomery's, he witnessed elaborate preparation. At Patton's crossing point, he saw evidence of hasty improvisation that worked despite violating every principle Churchill valued. He told his staff, "I'm beginning to understand why Americans won their independence from us. They simply don't believe in doing things properly. And somehow it works." Number 8. Express contempt for British caution. Patton made no secret of his opinions. British forces were too slow, too cautious, too concerned with minimizing casualties at the expense of tempo. When these comments reached Churchill, he was torn, offended at criticism of British forces, but also recognizing Patton had a point. Churchill had spent the entire war pushing his own generals to be more aggressive, to take risks, to stop being so careful. Now an American general was publicly saying what Churchill had said privately for years. Churchill couldn't decide if Patton was a useful critic exposing real problems or an arrogant American who didn't understand that Britain had been fighting since 1939 and learned caution through bitter experience. Number 7. Achieve better results than British generals. This was perhaps most uncomfortable. Patton's Third Army consistently outperformed British forces. Advance rate, territory liberated, prisoners captured, casualties per mile gained. Every metric favored Patton. Churchill had assumed British military experience would translate to superior performance. Instead, this aggressive American achieved better results. Churchill couldn't publicly acknowledge this without undermining British prestige, but privately he admitted to his war cabinet that Patton demonstrated qualities British generals lacked. Churchill began pushing his commanders to study Patton's methods. The fact that Britain's Prime Minister was telling British generals to learn from an American showed how completely Patton had exceeded expectations. Number 6. Maintain morale despite controversies. Churchill expected Patton's controversies would destroy his credibility. British officers who behaved similarly would lose their troops' confidence. Instead, Patton's soldiers loved him. Third Army had exceptional morale, low desertion rates, high re-enlistment. British liaison officers reported American soldiers forgave Patton's flaws because they trusted his tactical competence. They believed he cared about their lives by fighting aggressively rather than cautiously. This contradicted everything Churchill understood about military leadership. Number 5. Predict Soviet intentions accurately. Churchill had warned about Soviet expansionism since 1944. Most dismissed his concerns. Patton independently reached identical conclusions, expressed them more bluntly. Churchill was surprised his most vocal supporter was this controversial American who most dismissed as a simple warrior. Churchill attempted to coordinate with Patton on pushing harder lines against Soviet demands. But Patton's lack of diplomatic sophistication actually undermined Churchill's carefully crafted arguments. Churchill found himself distancing from someone who agreed with him because Patton's methods were counterproductive. Number 4. Earn respect from German commanders. Churchill read post-war interrogations showing German commanders feared Patton more than any Allied general, more than Montgomery, who'd actually defeated Rommel at El Alamein. This was embarrassing. German generals consistently called Patton the most dangerous opponent, praised his operational tempo, his aggressive tactics, his understanding of mobile warfare. Churchill realized if Germans acknowledged Patton's superiority, British assessments of American capability needed serious revision. Number 3. Refuse to accept American inferiority. British military culture in 1942-43 assumed British superiority. Most American generals seemed to accept this, deferred to British expertise. Patton refused completely. Never accepted Americans needed to learn from British example. Never acknowledged British methods were superior. Churchill initially found this arrogance offensive, but as Patton proved his methods worked, Churchill began to appreciate that Patton's refusal to accept inferiority had pushed American forces to excel. British generals, comfortable in assumed superiority, had perhaps become complacent. Number 2. Become more famous than Montgomery by 1945. Patton was more famous worldwide than Montgomery. This shocked Churchill. He'd carefully cultivated Montgomery's image as Britain's great general. Montgomery had defeated Rommel, planned D-Day's ground assault, commanded throughout northwest Europe. Yet Patton's theatrical personality made him more celebrated. Churchill understood publicity. He understood Patton had mastered modern media in ways Montgomery never could. But it stung that America's most famous general overshadowed Britain's most successful commander. Number 1. Prove American military equality. The most unexpected thing Patton did was comprehensively prove American forces were not junior partners but equals, perhaps superiors to British forces. Churchill had entered the war assuming Britain would lead the Western Alliance militarily. By 1945, American forces under commanders like Patton had surpassed British operational excellence. Churchill's post-war writings show him wrestling with this reality. He'd wanted American material support with British military leadership. Instead, American competence meant Britain had to accept genuine partnership. Patton demonstrated Americans could plan, execute, and win battles as well as any European army. For Churchill, who'd built his career on British imperial superiority, this was the most unexpected outcome of all. Churchill's final assessment, written in his war memoirs, captured his conflicted feelings. General Patton was perhaps the most controversial Allied commander, certainly the most theatrical, and possibly the most effective. He proved that American forces possessed not just material superiority, but operational excellence equal to any army in history. Whether this was entirely comfortable for Britain to accept is another question, but it was undeniably true. Churchill began the war expecting to guide inexperienced American forces. He ended it acknowledging American generals like Patton had achieved excellence Britain's commanders struggled to match. The student had become the master. The junior partner had become the equal. And one theatrical, controversial, brilliant general had forced that recognition. Patton never sought Churchill's approval, but he earned his respect. And in the process he changed how Britain viewed American military capability forever. If this deep dive into the complex relationship between Churchill and Patton fascinated you, then you need to subscribe to this channel immediately. We bring you the untold stories from history's greatest conflicts, the perspectives that challenge conventional narratives, and reveal the uncomfortable truths about who truly held military excellence during World War II. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video. Drop a comment about what surprised you most about Churchill and Patton's relationship. Share this with anyone who appreciates history that goes beyond simple hero worship. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected outcomes teach us the most important lessons about leadership, capability, and the hubris of assumed superiority.